The morning air in an American prisoner of war camp was often still, broken only by the sounds of boots on gravel and the distant clang of mess hall trays. For German soldiers confined behind the fences, these mornings could feel endless, each one blending into the next. Yet there was one ritual that caught their attention and stirred their curiosity. As they watched the guards and fellow captives prepare for the day, they noticed an act that seemed almost magical. A tin was opened, a brown powder was scooped, and within moments a steaming cup of coffee appeared without grinding, without brewing, without the familiar scent of roasted beans lingering in the air. To men raised on a culture of slow, deliberate coffee preparation, this sight was nothing short of astonishing. Imagine the disbelief of a German soldier standing in line for his ration when he first saw powder dissolve instantly into a dark, aromatic drink. In his memory, coffee had always been an event, one that required beans roasted to perfection, ground carefully, and steeped slowly in water. The sound of a grinder, the hiss of boiling water, and the rich fragrance filling a kitchen were all part of the ritual. Now, stripped of all that familiarity, coffee was transformed into something immediate, stripped of ceremony and effort. For many prisoners it seemed almost insulting to the drink they cherished. Yet they could not look away, for it revealed something deeper about the Americans who consumed it daily. This simple act of preparation was far more than a question of taste. It was a window into a culture that valued efficiency and speed, even in the most ordinary aspects of life. For the Americans, coffee was not an art form, but a necessity, a way to begin the day without wasting time. The soldiers in the camp stirred their cups casually, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with indifference, but always with ease. To the German POWs watching, it was as though their captors lived in a world where tradition had been replaced by practicality. The difference was subtle, yet powerful, and it set the stage for countless comparisons that followed. The ritual of instant coffee became a daily performance in these camps. Every morning, steam rose from metal cups, mingling with the crisp dawn air, carrying with it a scent that was both familiar and unfamiliar. For the Americans, it was comforting, a taste of home, an unremarkable part of their day. For the Germans, it was a source of curiosity and even discomfort, a reminder that they were far from their own world and traditions. This clash of perceptions played out in silence, in glances exchanged between prisoners, in quiet remarks passed through barbed wire. Something as ordinary as a cup of coffee had become a symbol of the distance between two cultures. It is striking to consider that in a time of war, when weapons and strategies defined survival, such a small detail could carry so much meaning. Yet in those quiet mornings, instant coffee became more than a drink. It became a marker of identity, of difference, and of power. The Germans were forced to confront not only their defeat, but also the values of a nation that operated in ways they had never imagined. With every cup stirred in those camps, the contrast grew clearer, shaping the way prisoners saw their captors and, ultimately, the world beyond the wire. For German prisoners of war, coffee was never just a beverage. In their minds, it carried with it the weight of tradition, of home, and of moments shared around a carefully prepared pot. The very act of roasting beans, grinding them by hand, and waiting patiently as hot water drew out their aroma was almost ceremonial. Coffee was meant to be savored, to be rich and layered in flavor, to demand respect. To see Americans reduce that ritual to a scoop of powder stirred in hot water felt almost like an insult. It was not coffee as they understood it, but something entirely different, and for many, it was difficult to accept. The contrast could not have been sharper. To an American soldier, instant coffee was a small miracle, proof of a nation that valued speed and convenience. It was efficient, portable, and reliable, a product that reflected the pace of modern life. To a German soldier, however, the same product was a sign of carelessness, of a culture willing to abandon tradition in the name of comfort. The bitterness of the drink was not just in its taste, but in what it represented. It revealed that even in something as simple as a morning ritual, two worlds stood far apart. Imagine the emotions of a German officer, raised in a society where meals and drinks carried deep cultural meaning, watching his captors casually gulp down a cup of instant coffee. The officer might recall long breakfasts back home, the sound of porcelain cups clinking in quiet kitchens, the smell of freshly ground beans filling the air. Now he sat in captivity, holding a cup that seemed hollow by comparison, its contents little more than a shadow of what he once knew. That gap between memory and reality deepened the sense of estrangement. The coffee itself was not the enemy, but what it represented was impossible to ignore. For the Americans, this difference was barely noticeable. To them, instant coffee was simply practical, another example of how their society had adapted to a modern world of machines, factories, and rapid production. They were not concerned with the loss of ritual because they measured value in different ways. Warmth, energy, and time saved were all that mattered. What the Germans saw as cheap and artificial, Americans viewed as ingenious and necessary. The difference in perspective turned a cup of coffee into a cultural battlefield, one that needed no words or weapons. This clash of perception was profound, even though it unfolded in silence. It reflected not just two approaches to coffee, but two worldviews colliding in the smallest of details. The Germans saw beauty in tradition, patience, and quality, while the Americans embraced speed, practicality, and abundance. Neither side was entirely wrong, but the difference highlighted a deeper truth. The war was not only fought with guns and tanks, but with ideas of how life should be lived. In that sense, instant coffee was more than a drink. It was a symbol of a modern world the Germans were unprepared to confront. The appearance of instant coffee in American prisoner of war camps was no coincidence. It was the product of a nation that had mastered industrial production on a massive scale, a society that could take something as familiar as coffee and reimagine it for speed and efficiency. Long before German prisoners ever saw it, instant coffee had already become woven into American life. Families across the United States brewed it at the breakfast table, soldiers carried it in their ration kits, and factories produced it in staggering quantities. For the Americans, it was not a rare luxury, but a common necessity. For the Germans who encountered it for the first time, that reality was difficult to comprehend. Scarcity shaped European life during the war, and coffee was no exception. For Germans, access to real coffee was limited, often replaced with substitutes that fell short of the rich drink they remembered. This made the ritual of preparation all the more important, a way of preserving dignity and culture even in times of hardship. The contrast with America's abundance was striking. The very existence of instant coffee revealed a society that had not only enough resources to experiment, but also the industrial might to put such experiments into every soldier's hands. To a prisoner staring at a steaming cup, the message was unmistakable. America had plenty, while Germany had little. For the Americans, the convenience of instant coffee was as valuable as its taste. Time was a currency during war, and every second saved mattered. A soldier in the field could boil water, stir powder, and drink within minutes, without the need for grinders, percolators, or elaborate preparation. The ritual of patience gave way to the practicality of speed. This approach spoke to the larger character of American wartime life, one in which innovation sought not perfection, but utility. The German prisoners, raised to see value in tradition, watched with a mix of confusion and awe as their captors embraced a culture of immediacy. In the camps, the differences were displayed daily in the simplest of ways. Americans treated their morning coffee as routine, pouring it quickly, drinking it quickly, and moving on. There was no pause to savor, no ceremony to observe, just efficiency. To the Germans, this was not merely unusual but symbolic. The drink they cherished as a rare, deliberate indulgence was treated by the Americans as nothing more than fuel. The very ordinariness of it highlighted how deeply instant coffee had become a part of American life. This shift from ritual to routine was more than a cultural quirk. It was the embodiment of how the United States viewed progress, a belief that technology and industry should make life faster, simpler, and more accessible. For Americans, instant coffee represented ingenuity, a small victory of science over tradition. For Germans, it was a reminder of loss, not only of flavor, but of meaning. In that difference lay the origins of a greater story, one in which even a cup of coffee could symbolize the gulf between two nations at war. On the battlefield, instant coffee was more than a drink. It was a lifeline, a small comfort that helped American soldiers endure the relentless grind of war. Imagine a cold dawn in a muddy trench, the air heavy with exhaustion and fear. A soldier could pull out his ration tin, pour hot water into a tin cup, stir the powder, and in minutes hold something warm in his hands. The heat of the cup against frozen fingers, the bitter taste filling his mouth, and the brief illusion of normal life all worked together to restore a fragment of strength. For the Americans, this simple act of preparation could mean the difference between despair and endurance. German soldiers, on the other hand, rarely experienced anything like this. Their coffee, when it was available, required far more effort, and often it was absent altogether. Shortages plagued the German army, and substitutes made from roasted grains or acorns reminded them of scarcity more than comfort. When German prisoners later learned that American soldiers had instant coffee at the front, many were astonished. The idea that an army could provide not just food, but such a convenience seemed almost unbelievable. To them, it was another sign of the vast industrial power behind the American war machine. In the chaos of combat, moments of rest were brief and precious. The ability to make coffee in minutes mattered. It gave soldiers a ritual they could rely on, something to break the monotony of rations and the constant tension of fighting. A steaming cup could create camaraderie as men gathered around small stoves or fires, sharing warmth and conversation. These small rituals mattered deeply, for they reminded the soldiers of home and of what they were fighting to return to. Instant coffee was not gourmet, but it was dependable. And in war, dependability was priceless. The psychological impact was just as important as the physical one. Soldiers facing days of rain, mud, and exhaustion needed reminders of humanity. Instant coffee offered that in a form that was immediate and tangible. The taste might have been simple, even harsh, but it carried with it the comfort of familiarity. For a soldier far from home, every sip connected him to family breakfasts, to ordinary mornings, and to the sense that life beyond war still existed. In that way, coffee was more than nourishment. It was hope in liquid form. German POWs often remarked on these differences. Hearing that Americans in the field could enjoy such conveniences made their own hardships seem sharper. For many, it was difficult to imagine how an enemy could fight a war while still finding time for such luxuries. Yet that was the truth of American industrial capacity. The same system that produced planes, tanks, and rifles also produced instant coffee by the ton. For the Germans, this was not just surprising, but demoralizing, a reminder that they faced an enemy whose resources seemed inexhaustible. Thus, the battlefield story of instant coffee was not only about the soldiers who drank it. It was about the deeper structures that made it possible. It reflected a nation that had mobilized its industry not just for victory in combat, but for sustaining the spirits of its men. A soldier with a hot drink in his hand could face another march, another battle, another day of uncertainty. And as German prisoners later realized, that small comfort, repeated countless times, was part of what gave the American army its endurance. Beyond the front lines, instant coffee carried meaning that stretched far into American society. At home, families brewed the same powder in their kitchens, sharing in the same ritual that soldiers performed at the front. This connection between the battlefield and the domestic sphere was powerful. Mothers, fathers, and children drank the same coffee as their sons and husbands overseas, creating an invisible thread that tied home to war. For the Germans, this was difficult to grasp. They came from a world where scarcity had made such luxuries rare, and the very idea that an entire population could share in abundance seemed almost impossible. In prisoner of war camps, this difference played out daily. German captives could see their guards preparing coffee with ease, just as they had in the field. The guards drank quickly, without hesitation, treating it as nothing special. Yet to the prisoners, every cup was a reminder of what they lacked, not only in captivity but in their own homeland. The smell of the drink lingered in the air, stirring emotions of envy, curiosity, and even resentment. For many, it was a small but constant reminder of the gap between the two nations. The wider consequences were cultural as much as they were material. Instant coffee came to represent an entirely different approach to life. To Americans, it was natural to embrace convenience, to take pride in making things faster, easier, and more accessible. To Germans who valued tradition and patience, this was unsettling. It was as though their captors had turned something sacred into something mechanical. Yet over time, some prisoners began to see the logic behind it. What had seemed cheap at first began to look like efficiency, and efficiency was something they could not deny. These realizations deepened the cultural contrast between the two peoples. The Germans were forced to see that the war was not only about armies and weapons, but also about ideas. The Americans lived by principles of mass production, abundance, and practicality. The Germans, raised in a culture of scarcity and ritual, could not ignore how powerful those principles had become. Even in captivity, they felt the weight of that difference. Coffee, once a simple drink, had become a symbol of modern power. The consequences of this shift lingered beyond the war itself. Many prisoners carried the memory of instant coffee with them long after they returned home. It was a taste that reminded them of captivity, but also of the strange efficiency of their captors. Some recalled it with distaste, others with reluctant admiration. What mattered most was that it remained in their memory as a marker of difference, a detail that defined how they remembered America. It showed that history is not only written in battles and treaties, but also in the ordinary objects that shape daily life. The realization came slowly, but for many German prisoners it was unavoidable. Each morning, as they watched Americans stir powder into hot water, they began to understand that this was not simply about coffee. It was about a way of life, one that valued speed, innovation, and practicality above ritual. What had first seemed laughable or even offensive began to appear as something much larger. Instant coffee, in its unassuming form, revealed the cultural engine that powered the United States. For the prisoners, the difference became undeniable. Imagine a camp filled with silent observation, German eyes following every step of a guard's routine. The clink of a metal spoon against a cup, the steam rising from the liquid, the casual ease with which it was consumed. To the Americans, this was nothing unusual. But to the Germans, it was a performance that spoke volumes. Every sip reinforced the notion that their captors belonged to a world driven by abundance and convenience, while their own culture clung to scarcity and tradition. The climax of this encounter lay in that dawning understanding. What struck the prisoners most was not just the product itself, but the mindset behind it. The Americans did not measure quality in the same way. They measured it in terms of time saved, energy restored, and consistency guaranteed. The Germans, who prided themselves on craftsmanship and depth, found themselves staring at a nation that had embraced a different definition of progress. The clash was not only about taste, but about philosophy. In this moment, instant coffee became a mirror, reflecting two civilizations. For some prisoners, the shock turned into quiet admiration. They began to see that the very things they had mocked were what gave their captors strength. The efficiency, the practicality, the ability to strip away ceremony and focus on function, all of this had fueled the American war effort. Instant coffee, they realized, was not inferior, but purposeful. It had been designed to fit the demands of a modern industrial war. The German prisoners living in defeat could not deny the truth staring back at them with every cup. This climax was not marked by arguments or confrontations. It unfolded in silence, in the shared spaces of the camp, in the unspoken recognition of difference. It was the kind of revelation that required no words, only observation. A tin of powder, a cup of water, a sip of coffee. Small actions repeated each day until they etched themselves into memory. By the time the prisoners understood what it meant, the symbol had already taken root. Instant coffee was no longer just a curiosity. It was proof of a world that had moved forward, leaving old traditions behind. When the war finally ended and German prisoners returned home, they carried with them more than memories of fences, guards, and long days of captivity. They carried impressions of America that were etched into the smallest details of daily life. Among those impressions, instant coffee stood out. It was a symbol of the strange, efficient, and unfamiliar culture they had encountered. For many, it became inseparable from their memory of defeat, a drink that reminded them of how different their captors truly were. What seemed trivial at first had taken on lasting weight. In the years that followed, these former prisoners shared stories with family and friends. They spoke of a nation that had industrialized even the most ordinary rituals. Some recalled the bitterness of the drink, comparing it unfavorably with the rich brews of home. Others admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that its convenience was undeniable. In these stories, instant coffee became more than a taste. It became a shorthand for America itself, a place where practicality was valued over tradition and abundance over scarcity. The legacy of that cup traveled far beyond the camps where it was first encountered. For Americans, instant coffee was never a symbol. It was simply a fact of life, as ordinary as bread or sugar. Yet the way it was perceived by German prisoners shows how history can be shaped by the smallest of things. While battles and treaties decided the war, everyday habits shaped the way one people saw another. A tin of powder, a metal spoon, a steaming cup, these were not weapons, yet they carried their own kind of power. They influenced memory, perception, and even identity. Over time, the story of instant coffee in captivity reveals a broader truth. The objects we take for granted can hold extraordinary meaning in the eyes of others. For the Germans, this humble drink encapsulated the speed, abundance, and pragmatism of a foreign culture. For the Americans, it was nothing more than routine. And yet, in the meeting of those two perspectives, something lasting was created. Instant coffee became a symbol of contrast, of difference, and of the invisible ways cultures collide. The legacy of this unlikely symbol reminds us that history is not only made in moments of violence or negotiation, but also in the quiet details of daily life. The taste of coffee, the ease of preparation, the astonishment of those who had never seen it before, all of these left a mark that endured long after the war was over. In this way, instant coffee became part of the story of World War II, not as a weapon or a strategy, but as a testament to how even the smallest habits can reflect the values of a nation. And for the German prisoners who once watched with disbelief, that memory would never entirely fade.